Oh, Jeff is up.
There we go.
Hello, Jeff.
Hi. Hi, Jen.
Hey, how's it going?
Hi, Russell.
Hello.
Hi. Let me just turn down my computer a bit here. Okay. So,
Thank you
anyway,
for doing that.
I have a gift for you guys. I'm an atheist, and I discovered an article that was written last year in July of 2014, and it talks about the claustrum. And the claustrum is an area of the brain which is involved in consciousness. And an experiment was done where this woman was basically they took an electrode and they put it onto this area of the brain, and when the electrode was energized, she lost consciousness. And then immediately, when the electrical impulses were stopped, she regained consciousness. So this says to me that consciousness is a product of the brain.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure
Right.
is.
Okay. Now, of course, this was only one experiment. And I had to laugh because I heard you guys talking about confirmation bias earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't really a rock solid scientific study because only one experiment was done with one woman who was the subject, and it wasn't like an extensive experiment with a bunch of people, which would have been much more convincing. But it did show that this one experiment did show that the claustrum is involved in consciousness. It's the center of consciousness, and so that kind of, I mean, if that's correct, I'm not saying that one experiment proves it, although I would like to think that. I'm not saying that one experiment proves it, but if that's correct, then basically the whole idea of mind-body dualism has been refuted.
Well, let's see, a couple of things. First of all, that may only be one individual experiment with that particular part of the brain, but there are a whole lot of, there's a long history of people doing experiments in neuroscience, like, for instance, the very well documented effect of what happens when you separate the left and right hemispheres from each other. This is actually beyond what I've said already pretty much covers what I know about the subject. So I don't want to sit here and talk like I'm an expert on it. But I think that the dominant mode of thinking among people who study the brains is obviously that there are a whole lot of different parts of the brain that affect different ways of thinking. And if your brain is sufficiently damaged, you stop being conscious. So I think that there's very little scientific doubt, basically, that the processes of the brain are mostly, almost entirely responsible for the way that people think. And then again, I also want to say that people who want to believe that there is some kind of magic behind it, people who believe that there's some kind of spirit world, are very adept at coming up with all kinds of excuses why those scientific experiments don't mean a damn thing, because, I don't know, you'd have to ask them.
Right.
Anything to add, Jen?
Well,
No,
I mean, and of course, like I said before, this is not a rock solid scientific study. It was only done with one woman who was the subject of the experiment. And so I guess, confirmation bias applies to the believers and us who are atheists also.
Sure.
'Cause
everybody has confirmation bias. You have to be
Yes.
aware of it all the time.
Right. I would like to believe that this that this scientific study was the be all and end all, and this proved, that consciousness was simply a brain process, but we can't say that for sure at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think we can say that consciousness is part of a brain process.
Yeah. I mean, definitely. Like I said, this one experiment isn't the only experiment that's ever been done by people studying brains.
And specifically, this, I mean, I just pulled up a write-up on this experiment while we were talking here. And I mean, all this experiment did was identify a region that could basically serve as an on-off switch for someone being conscious or unconscious.
Yes.
It's not switching the brain off and on. It's basically...
Right, but
changing a state.
But consciousness is an element of the soul. When people talk about the soul,
what?
No.
Wait, what soul?
But in order to have the whole experience of the afterlife, you have to have consciousness.
You're playing devil's advocate here, right?
Well,
I mean, you're not serious about there being a soul or an
afterlife. In order to have the whole experience of the afterlife, you must have consciousness, because you have to be able to experience heaven or to experience hell, and you can't do that without consciousness.
I mean, theoretically, although, if you want to get all sci-fi about it, there have been a lot of stories about people who transferred their, whatever the processes of their brains were to, computer bodies, or, robots, or become sentient computers. And while that's not something that we've actually managed to accomplish, those same philosophical questions are raised where, you put my brain into into some kind of robot body, and the robot says, "Hey, I'm Russell. I remember when I was 7 years old and I experienced this thing when I was living in Alabama." And it's hard to tell the difference between somebody who is actually Russell and somebody who just has all the same experiences and memories and acts just like Russell, right? So I would say consciousness is tied to a physical process, but it doesn't have to necessarily be the same physical process. Again, if you want to get all sci-fi about it.
But my point is that in order to experience the torture of hell, you have to have some level of consciousness.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And so if consciousness is tied to the brain, then there's no way to experience the bliss of heaven or the torture of hell if consciousness is simply a process of the brain.
Well, I think that we didn't need this study to know that this concept of an afterlife is nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we already know that you can radically alter someone's personality, just with a brain injury. And again, all these things are well documented in the literature. I mean, I don't really think this particular study is all that groundbreaking in terms of, refuting this idea of a soul or an afterlife.
But I think that it kind of nails down the idea that mind-body dualism is simply incorrect. I think it just kind of...
It is one of many things that makes it hard to swallow.
Right.
Anyway.
Right. Well, I just felt that this was especially compelling, this article that I read. So,
well, thanks for sharing it with us.
Yeah.
Oh, and one more little thing, if I could add, before I go, that also I wanted to talk about the effect that the belief in God has on people's lives. Now,
yeah, well, make it quick. We're heading towards wrapping up the show.
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, for example, you'll hear people say, "Well, I was a drug addict for many years, and God saved me from my addiction." Well, actually, I don't think that. Obviously, I'm an atheist. I believe that what it was the idea of God, and it wasn't actually this invisible being in the sky. It was the idea of God that saved them.
Sure, I'll go with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's like
Anyway.
so it's like
Yeah.
if you have chronic pain and
Okay.
you take a sugar pill.
I think your point's made. Thanks for calling. Okay, we're going to go on to Brandon in Florida.
Okay.
Anything else on your mind, Jen? I have it.
Well, I wouldn't even say it was the idea of God. I think that people who are addicted and who manage to break their addiction to something, I think they do all the heavy lifting on that and
I agree.
all the work. And unfortunately, some people are just too willing to give God credit for that.
Yeah,